Master Sergeant Anya Sharma's boots met the packed earth of forward operating base Kestrel with a sound so soft it was almost lost to the incessant whisper of the wind. The air tasted of dust and diesel. Around her, the base hummed with the nervous energy of a place that had forgotten what peace felt like. Young soldiers, lean and wired, moved in quick, jerky bursts, their motions sharp with adrenaline and the bravado of youth. They called her too slow. Not to her face, of course, but the sentiment traveled on the dry air, in the sideways glances and the faint smirks. Her measured, deliberate pace was an anomaly here, a rock in a rushing stream. They saw a woman nearing the end of a long career, assigned to this forgotten outpost as a final, quiet stop before retirement. They saw the slight gray at her temples and the calm in her eyes, and they mistook it for fatigue. But Anya was not slow. She was economical, and she was about to demonstrate the vast, lethal difference between speed and efficiency, a lesson that would culminate in her beating the base champion's time by a full 40 seconds. She walked from the transport pad toward the command tent. Her duffel bag settled comfortably on one shoulder. Every step was placed, not simply taken. Her gaze swept across the perimeter, a silent, automatic assessment. She noted the placement of the HESCO barriers, the interlocking fields of fire from the guard towers, and the one blind spot near the western fence where the terrain dipped just enough to hide a crawling man for 17 meters. She saw the sag in a concertina wire barrier, the faint sheen of a hydraulic leak on the chassis of a light armored vehicle, the way a young private held his rifle with his shoulders tensed up to his ears, a sure sign of poor discipline and wasted energy. These details flowed into her, processed and filed without a single outward sign. The soldiers who bustled past her saw only a middle-aged NCO walking at a pace unsuited for a war zone. They didn't see the calculus happening behind her placid expression. They didn't see the predator assessing its new hunting ground. Corporal Diaz nudged Private Evans as she passed. "See? That's the new Master Sergeant for the Armory. Transfer from a supply depot in Germany. Probably spent the last decade counting boots and blankets." Evans grunted, his eyes following her. "She moves like she's walking through honey. Thorn's gonna eat her alive." Anya heard them. She had heard variations of the same sentiment at a dozen posts over 2 decades. It was the predictable chorus of the young and the eager, men who equated frantic motion with progress. They saw the surface, the calm exterior, and assumed the fire within had long since gone out. They had no way of knowing that her stillness was not an absence of energy, but a perfect containment of it. She did not waste a single calorie, a single thought, on anything that was not essential to the mission. Her walk, which they derided as slow, was a masterclass in conservation of movement, a physical manifestation of a mind that had stripped away every extraneous element until only pure, cold function remained. She reached the flap of the command tent, pausing for a half-second to let her eyes adjust before stepping from the blinding sun into the cool, artificial twilight of the Tactical Operations Center. Her arrival was a quiet affair, a stone dropped into a pond that made no immediate splash, but whose ripples were destined to reach every shore. Colonel Marcus Thorne believed the universe could be ordered by sheer force of will. His office was a testament to this philosophy. His desk was a vast, uncluttered expanse of polished wood. 3 perfectly aligned pens sat parallel to a single, squared-away stack of reports. On the wall behind him, maps were pinned with geometric precision, the lines of advance and defensive positions drawn with a ruler. He looked at Anya as she stood before him, his gaze a tool of measurement, and he found her wanting. He saw her file on his screen, a document so heavily redacted it was more black ink than text. He saw her last post, Quartermaster Logistics, Ramstein. He saw her age. He connected these dots into a simple, dismissive narrative. "Master Sergeant Sharma," he began, his voice flat, the tone of a man already moving on to his next task. "Welcome to Kestrel. Things here are dynamic. We don't have the luxury of a garrison pace. Every second counts. Every movement has to have purpose." The unspoken accusation hung in the air between them. "Your pace is a liability. Your movements lack purpose." Anya stood at a perfect parade rest, her hands clasped behind her back. Her expression was neutral. She simply listened. Her stillness seemed to irritate him, a passive challenge to his world of aggressive action. "Your file is thin," he continued, gesturing vaguely at the screen. "Says you're an expert in small arms inventory and maintenance. We can certainly use that. The armory needs a firm hand. It's become a social club for Sergeant Graves and his disciples." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "This is not a retirement post, Master Sergeant. The enemy is less than 20 clicks from our wire in any direction. I need people who can keep up. Are you going to be able to keep up?" The question was a direct insult, wrapped in the guise of professional concern. He was asking if an old woman from a supply depot could handle the pressure. Anya's mind, a place of deep and disciplined calm, registered the slight but assigned it no emotional weight. It was merely data. The colonel was a man who saw the world through a narrow lens of physicality. He valued explosive speed over deliberate precision. He was a product of a system she knew all too well, a system that often promoted the loudest and fastest, not necessarily the most effective. "I will perform my duties to the best of my ability, sir," she said. Her voice was even, carrying no hint of defiance or resentment. It was a simple statement of fact. Thorne leaned back, unsatisfied. He had wanted a spark, a defensive reaction, something that would confirm her unsuitability. Her placid response was like punching water. "Fine," he clipped out. "Sergeant Graves is our training NCO and runs the armory. He sets the tone for the grunts on this base. He's fast, he's aggressive, and he gets results. You will report to him. Get the armory organized. I want a full inventory and serviceability report on my desk by Friday." "Dismissed." She executed a crisp about-face and walked out. She didn't hurry. Her steps were the same measured, rhythmic cadence as before. Thorne watched her go, a frown creasing his brow. He felt a flicker of uncertainty, a sense that he had missed something vital, but he dismissed it. She was just a clerk, a logistician. Slow. In his mind, the matter was settled. He had put her in a box, both literally and figuratively, assigning her to the windowless confines of the armory where her languid pace couldn't disrupt the high tempo of his command. He turned back to his maps, confident in his assessment, completely unaware that he had just relegated the most dangerous person on his base to the one place that contained all of its weapons. The armory at FOB Kestrel was a microcosm of the base itself, functional on the surface but deeply flawed underneath. It smelled of gun oil, sweat, and complacency. Weapons were racked, ammunition was stacked, but there was no system, no flow. Sergeant Rex Graves had organized it for quick access by his own clique, the men who formed his inner circle of training acolytes. For everyone else, it was a chaotic puzzle. Anya saw it all in the first 5 minutes. She didn't begin by counting rifles. She began by watching. She stood near the checkout window for 3 hours, a silent, unmoving observer. She watched soldiers come and go, their movements a language she was fluent in. She saw the swagger of Graves' favorites, who would grab their rifles with a practiced, sloppy familiarity, their trigger discipline lax until they were outside the door. She saw the hesitation of the new replacements, fumbling with magazines, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She saw a young lieutenant who couldn't properly clear his sidearm, his hands shaking almost imperceptibly as he performed the motions he'd learned by rote but never truly mastered. Anya cataloged it all. These were not just soldiers, they were weapon systems, and she needed to know the condition of each one. Sergeant Graves entered the armory like a conquering hero returning to his court. He was a bull of a man, with a chest and shoulders built from years in the gym and a swagger polished by the admiration of younger, more impressionable soldiers. He saw Anya standing in the corner and a smirk touched his lips. "Master Sergeant," he said, his voice a theatrical boom. "The colonel told me you'd be gracing us with your presence. Finally get that paperwork under control," maybe he laughed, and a few of the other soldiers in the armory chuckled along with him. Anya turned her head slowly to look at him. "Sergeant." The single word, delivered without inflection, seemed to suck the energy out of his performance. He had expected deference or perhaps a nervous attempt to placate him. He got neither. "Right," he said, recovering. "Well, the inventory logs are over there. Knock yourself out." He turned his back on her, a clear dismissal, and began talking loudly with his men about his latest record-breaking run on the Gauntlet, the base's notoriously difficult obstacle and combat readiness course. Anya ignored him. Her attention was on the weapons themselves. She moved down the racks, her pace still unhurried. But her hands were a different story. They moved with a surgeon's precision. She didn't just look at a rifle. She picked it up, feeling its balance. Her thumb would find the selector switch, testing its tension. A finger would trace the line of the gas tube, feeling for minute warping from overheating. She'd unlatch the receiver, and with a few economic flicks of her wrist, the bolt carrier group would be in her palm. Her eyes would scan the locking lugs for stress fractures, the firing pin for wear, the carbon buildup in places a lazy cleaning would miss. She found a dozen small but potentially fatal flaws in the first rack alone. A bent front sight post on one M4, a worn-out extractor spring on another, a barely perceptible crack in the polymer frame of a pistol. These were the kinds of failures that didn't appear during routine inspection but would announce themselves catastrophically in the middle of a firefight. The armory wasn't just disorganized. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Graves and his men were focused on the flashy metrics. Speed on the obstacle course, tight groupings on a paper target. They had forgotten that the true measure of a weapon was its absolute reliability in the moment of truth. Anya was not just counting inventory. She was gauging the base's true readiness, and what she found was terrifying. The first sign of crisis arrived as a burst of static over the command frequency, a voice made thin and desperate by distance and failing technology. A long-range reconnaissance team, call sign Stalker, was pinned down in a narrow valley 12 clicks east of the wire. They had stumbled upon a larger-than-expected enemy force assembling for a push, and their position was compromised. Their primary communications were down, and their backup SATCOM unit was failing, its encrypted battery fading fast. Without a fresh battery, they would be silent, and by dawn, they would be overrun. The voice on the radio was young, laced with a tremor he was trying and failing to conceal. "Kestrel Command, this is Stalker 2. Our power is critical. We are painting the target, but we are running on fumes." "How copy?" The voice cut out. In the TOC, chaos bloomed. Colonel Thorne stood over the communications console, his face a grim mask. "Get them on the line. Find them." He barked at the technicians. Maps were unfurled. Coordinates shouted. The airdrop was their only option, a low-altitude, high-speed pass to kick a resupply container out over their last known position. But the container had to hold the specific battery for their encrypted radio, the DR5. "Supply. Where are the DR5s? Thorne roared into his own radio. "I need them 5 minutes ago." The answer that came back was fragmented and panicked. The batteries had arrived in a recent shipment, but the manifest was a mess. The entire depot was a jumble of crates from a forward base that had been rapidly decommissioned. Soldiers were tearing through the supply tent, prying open containers marked medical, rations, spare parts. They found bandages, food, vehicle filters. They found everything except the small, dense batteries that meant the difference between life and death for the men of Stalker Team. The pressure in the TOC was a physical thing, a crushing weight of dwindling time. Thorne's knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of a map table. His carefully ordered world was disintegrating into frantic, unproductive motion. The very thing he valued most, speed, was failing him. His men were moving fast, but they were moving without direction, their panic compounding the confusion. Every unopened crate that didn't hold the batteries ratcheted up the tension. Another grain of sand slipping through the hourglass. The patrol had less than an hour of battery life left. After that, they would be ghosts. Anya was in the armory, meticulously disassembling a rifle's bolt carrier group, when the shouts from the TOC reached her. She didn't react at first. She continued her work, wiping a thin layer of solvent on the extractor claw, her movements fluid and unbothered. She had learned long ago that panic is a contagion, and the only antidote is a deliberate calm. But she was listening. The words, "stalker," "pinned down," and DR5 battery were clear enough. She set the rifle components down on a clean cloth in their correct order and walked out of the armory. She moved at her usual pace, a steady rhythm that seemed almost surreal against the backdrop of desperate, running figures. She entered the supply depot, a cavernous tent filled with the noise of splintering wood and shouted frustrations. A young private nearly ran her over, his face pale with stress. "Excuse me, Master Sergeant," he stammered, before rushing off to attack another crate. Colonel Thorne was in the center of the storm, his face flushed with anger. "Check the manifests again," he yelled at a harried-looking supply clerk. "They have to be here." Anya's eyes didn't focus on the chaos. They scanned the crates. She wasn't looking at the primary labels stenciled in large black letters. She was looking at the smaller markings, the shipping codes, the transfer numbers, the faint, almost invisible stamps from the depot of origin. Her mind was a cross-referencing engine, pulling up the memory of 1,000 dry logistics directives she had read not because she had to, but because she believed knowledge was ammunition. She remembered a sub-protocol for the shipment of sensitive electronic warfare components, Directive 734B, Annex C. It was designed to protect such equipment from being easily identified and stolen during chaotic transfers. She walked past Thorne, her gaze fixed on a stack of containers in the far corner. He saw her out of the corner of his eye, and a fresh spike of irritation shot through him. "Master Sergeant, what in the hell are you doing? Get out of the way. We don't have time for a leisurely stroll." Anya didn't respond. She stopped in front of a large crate with meteorological sensors stenciled on its side. It looked innocuous, forgotten. It was the last thing anyone would think to check. She pointed. "That one," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. A corporal with a pry bar looked from her to the colonel, confused. Thorne was about to order her out again, but something in her absolute certainty gave him pause. It wasn't a guess. It was a statement of fact. "Do it," he growled at the corporal. "Open it." The corporal jammed the pry bar under the lid and heaved. The wood groaned and splintered. He threw the lid aside. Inside, nestled in a bed of thick packing foam, was an array of delicate weather monitoring equipment. Thorne's face fell. "I knew it," he muttered, turning away. "A waste of time." "Underneath," Anya said, her voice still calm, still certain. "Check under the top layer of foam." The corporal, now intrigued, pulled out the large piece of protective foam. And there it was, a small, gray, hardened pelican case. He unlatched it. Inside, perfectly seated in custom-cut foam, were 6 DR5 batteries, their indicator lights glowing with a faint, healthy green. The depot went silent. The frantic energy vanished, replaced by a stunned stillness. Anya looked at the supply clerk who was still staring at his manifest. "Directive 734B, Annex C," she said quietly. "Sensitive electronics are often mislabeled as low-value items during emergency redeployments." Standard procedure, she had not raised her voice. She had not gloated. She had simply stated the truth, a truth that had been hidden in plain sight, accessible to anyone who had done the reading. She turned and walked out of the tent, her job done, leaving a stunned colonel and a tent full of humbled soldiers in her wake. The resupply drop was successful. Stalker team got their batteries, re-established communications, and guided a devastating air strike onto the enemy assembly point. The immediate threat to the base was neutralized. The men of the patrol were alive. Back at FOB Kestrel, the story of what happened in the supply depot spread faster than any official report. It wasn't a dramatic tale of heroism, but a quiet, almost unbelievable account of surgical precision in the midst of chaos. The whispers about the slow Master Sergeant changed. The snickering stopped. It was replaced by a confused curiosity. Private Evans and Corporal Diaz were cleaning their weapons outside the barracks, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the compound. "I was there," Diaz said, his voice low. "She just walked in. Didn't run, didn't shout. Everyone else was losing their minds and she was like ice. Just pointed to the box. But how did she know? Evans asked, scrubbing at a patch of carbon on his rifle's bolt. Lucky guess. No. Diaz shook his head. It wasn't a guess. The way she said it, it was like she was telling you the sky is blue. She just knew. He paused, looking over toward the armory. That's not slowness. That's something else. The shift in perception was most palpable in the command tent. Colonel Thorne had not spoken to Anya directly since the incident. He offered no thanks, no acknowledgement. But he watched her. When she crossed the compound, his eyes would follow her from the window of his office. His rigid certainty about her had been fractured. He had built his command on the principle of aggressive speed, and she had solved a crisis he couldn't with quiet knowledge and a deliberate pace. It was a challenge to his entire worldview, and he didn't know how to process it. His dismissal had curdled into a grudging, wary observation. He needed to understand her. He needed to see what else she was capable of. The only person who remained openly dismissive was Sergeant Graves. His ego, intrinsically tied to his reputation as the base's alpha, could not accept that a logistics clerk had succeeded where he and his men had failed. He saw her newfound respect as an indirect slight to him. It was a fluke, he told his followers in the armory, his voice full of forced bravado. She read some boring manual once. Big deal. That doesn't mean anything out on the wire. Let's see her run the gauntlet. That's a real test. Not shuffling papers, he was projecting his own insecurity, drawing a line in the sand between what he considered real soldiering, the physical, the fast, the violent, and the intellectual competence Anya had displayed. He wanted to pull her onto his battlefield, a place of sweat and muscle, certain he could reassert his dominance there. He did not realize he was inviting a ghost to a gunfight. Colonel Thorne decided he needed a definitive answer. The questions about Master Sergeant Sharma were an unstable element in the rigid equation of his command. He couldn't reconcile the woman from the supply depot with the woman who had calmly located the DR-5s. So he manufactured a test, cloaking it in the guise of a routine readiness evaluation. He announced a mandatory proficiency check for all senior NCOs. The centerpiece of the evaluation would be a timed run through the gauntlet. It was a brutal course, a combination of obstacles designed to test strength and endurance, interspersed with 3 live-fire shooting stations that demanded precision under physical duress. Everyone on the base knew it was Sergeant Graves' kingdom. His record, 3 minutes and 15 seconds, was considered untouchable. The entire off-duty contingent of the base gathered to watch. The air was thick with anticipation. This was more than a training exercise, it was a showdown. Graves was in his element, soaking in the attention, his movements exaggerated and powerful as he warmed up. Anya stood off to the side, performing a series of slow, deliberate stretches. She looked less like a competitor and more like someone preparing for a yoga class. Thorne himself acted as the official timer. "Sergeant Graves, you have the honor," he said. Graves grinned, stepped up to the starting line, and on the signal he exploded into motion. He was a force of nature. He vaulted the first wall, his muscles bunching. He powered through the low crawl under barbed wire, kicking up a storm of dust. He was pure aggression, attacking the course, his face a mask of furious effort. At the shooting stations, he ripped his rifle up, fired a rapid volley of shots, and sprinted to the next obstacle. His movements were incredibly fast, but ragged. He finished, chest heaving, and threw his arms up in triumph as the soldiers roared their approval. Thorne clicked the stopwatch. 3 minutes, 15 seconds. The record stands. Graves, panting heavily, walked over to Anya, a triumphant smirk on his sweaty face. "Your turn, Master Sergeant. Try to keep up." Anya walked to the starting line. She took 2 slow, deep breaths, her body relaxing. When Thorne gave the signal, she didn't explode. She flowed. She started at a steady, deceptively ground-eating pace. At the high wall, instead of trying to muscle over it, she used a climber's technique, finding the optimal foot and hand holds, using leverage and balance to carry herself over with what looked like minimal effort. Through the low crawl, she was a snake, staying flat, her movements economical and fluid, conserving energy where graves had burned it. The crowd grew quiet. They were confused. It looked so slow. It looked too easy. But the clock was running. At the first shooting station, she didn't tear her rifle from its sling. She brought it up in a single, smooth motion that ended perfectly in the pocket of her shoulder. Her breathing, which was barely elevated, paused for a second. Pop pop. 2 rounds, perfectly centered. She moved to the next target. Pop pop. She didn't waste a single motion realigning. Her transition was flawless. She moved through the rest of the course with the same surreal efficiency. There was no wasted energy, no frantic scrambling. Every step, every handhold, every breath was perfectly calculated, part of a single, continuous, efficient action. She crossed the finish line. She wasn't panting. Her expression was the same calm, neutral mask it always was. She took a single deep breath and stood at ease. The silence was absolute. Everyone was looking at Colonel Thorne, who was staring at the stopwatch in his hand as if it were a venomous insect. His face was pale. He looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He cleared his throat. "Time," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He cleared his throat again and spoke louder, his voice cracking slightly. "Time. 2 minutes. And 25 seconds. The statement fell into the stunned silence like a physical object. 40 seconds. She had beaten the record not by a fraction of a second, but by an eternity. She had shattered it. Sergeant Graves' jaw was slack. His face a canvas of utter humiliation and disbelief. The soldiers stared, their minds struggling to reconcile what they had seen. The slow woman, the clerk, the logistician, had just put on a display of physical prowess so advanced, so efficient, that it looked like a different sport altogether. She hadn't been fast. She had been perfect. And perfection, it turned out, was 40 seconds faster than anyone on this base had ever imagined. Colonel Thorne walked back to his office as if in a trance. The number echoed in his mind. 2 minutes, 25 seconds. It wasn't just a good time. It was an impossible time. It defied the laws of physics and human endurance as he understood them. A time like that wasn't the result of training. It was the result of a fundamental rewiring of a human being. The woman he had dismissed as a paper pusher was something else entirely, and the heavily redacted file on his desk was no longer an administrative annoyance but a critical intelligence gap he had to fill. He sealed the door to his communications hut, a small, soundproof box filled with the hum of encryption hardware. He placed a secure call to CENTCOM's personnel division, a direct line to a 3-star general he had served under years ago. "Marcus," the general's voice crackled through the speaker. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Trouble with the locals?" "General, I need a file unredacted." "Operational necessity," Thorne said, his voice tight. "Master Sergeant Anya Sharma." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sharma? Are you sure you have the right name, Marcus? We have no Master Sergeant by that name on active deployment. She's here at FOB Kestrel. Her file says she came from Ramstein Logistics." The silence that followed was heavier, more profound. Thorne could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard. "Marcus," the general said, his voice now stripped of all warmth, low and serious. "Describe her." Thorne described her. The age, the calm demeanor, the unervingly efficient movements. He described what had happened in the supply depot. He described the impossible time on the gauntlet. Another silence, then a sigh. "Oh hell, she wasn't supposed to be there. Marcus, what I'm about to tell you is classified above your pay grade. I'm initiating a temporary clearance uplift for you. It will expire in 1 hour. Forget everything you hear after that." An encrypted data packet arrived on Thorne's terminal. He entered the authorization codes the general provided. The file on Anya Sharma, once a sea of black boxes, bloomed into text and images. Thorne began to read, and the foundations of his world began to crumble. Master Sergeant Anya Sharma had never worked a day in logistics in her life. She was a founding member of a deeply classified, Tier 1 Special Operations Group known as Project Chimera. It wasn't a unit, it was a concept. They took the most promising operators and retrained them from the ground up, focusing not on strength or speed, but on absolute kinetic efficiency. They were taught to see combat as a problem of geometry and physics, to eliminate every wasted motion, every extraneous thought. They were human equations designed for maximum lethality with minimum effort. Anya Sharma hadn't just been a member. She had been the lead instructor, the architect of their entire doctrine. Her call sign was metronome. The name was a reference to her uncanny internal rhythm, her ability to maintain a perfect, steady cadence of action under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The file detailed a dozen missions that were the stuff of whispered legend in the intelligence community. Hostage rescues, counterproliferation operations, targeted assassinations carried out with surgical precision. There were commendations signed by generals he had only ever seen in photographs. The assignment to Ramstein and then to Kestrel had been a ghost protocol after a mission in Eastern Europe had gone public in a minor way. Her face compromised, command had buried her deep inside the system under a false identity. It was to protect her, to let the trail go cold. FOB Kestrel was chosen for its isolation. It was supposed to be a place where metronome could simply disappear for a year. Thorne leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen illuminating his stunned face. Her slowness wasn't a weakness. It was her greatest weapon. It was the physical manifestation of a discipline so complete it was almost inhuman. He hadn't been watching a soldier nearing retirement. He had been watching a master at the absolute pinnacle of her craft. He hadn't dismissed a clerk. He had dismissed a legend. The next morning, the air on the base was different. The story of Anya's 42nd victory had permeated every corner of FOB Kestrel, mutating from rumor into myth overnight. The soldiers who had once smirked at her now averted their eyes, their simple worldview of strength and speed completely upended. They didn't understand what they had seen, but they knew it was something to be feared and respected. Anya walked toward the mess hall for breakfast. Her pace was unchanged. She was the same woman she had been the day before, but the world around her had been irrevocably altered. The usual morning chatter died down as she approached. Soldiers instinctively straightened their posture, their boisterous energy subdued by her presence. They parted for her, creating a silent corridor. Sergeant Graves was standing by the door, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked like he hadn't slept. The humiliation of the previous day had stripped him of his swagger, leaving behind something raw and humbled. He saw her coming and his face tightened. For a moment it looked like he might turn away, but he didn't. He set his coffee down, stood tall, and faced her as she drew near. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He brought his hand up in a salute. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture exchanged between colleagues. It was slow, sharp, and held with rigid formality. It was the salute of a subordinate to a superior, a student to a master. It was a public and unconditional surrender of his status, an acknowledgement of her profound and undeniable skill. The entire mess hall watched, holding its breath. Anya stopped in front of him. She looked him in the eye, seeing the shattered pride and the nascent respect warring there. She gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. It was an acceptance of his gesture, a closing of the chapter. Graves dropped his salute and stepped aside, clearing her path. As Anya entered the chow line, Colonel Thorne walked into the mess hall. The room, which had just begun to regain its murmur, fell silent again. Thorne ignored everyone else. His eyes were fixed on Anya. He walked directly to her, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Master Sergeant Sharma," he said. His voice was loud and clear, intended for everyone to hear. The condescending tone he had used in their first meeting was gone, replaced by a formal, professional respect. "My office. 0800 hours," he paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "We are redesigning the base's entire defensive posture and training protocols. I require your expertise." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't an order given to a subordinate. It was a concession from a commander to an expert whose authority he now recognized as absolute. He was handing her the keys to his kingdom. Anya simply replied, "Yes, sir," and continued down the line to get her food, her expression giving nothing away. But everyone in that room understood. The hierarchy of FOB Kestrel had just been redrawn, not by rank, but by sheer, undeniable competence. Dusk settled over FOB Kestrel, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The frantic energy of the day bled away, replaced by the quiet hum of generators and the lonely cry of the wind against the perimeter fence. Anya Sharma was not in Thorne's office redesigning protocols, nor was she in the armory conducting inventory. She was alone on the far end of the firing range, a solitary figure against the fading light. She was not engaged in the rapid, percussive practice of combat shooting. She was practicing something far more fundamental: stillness. She stood in a relaxed but perfectly balanced firing stance, her rifle held at the low ready. For minutes at a time, she would simply stand, breathing, feeling the weight of the weapon in her hands until it ceased to be a tool and became a part of her. Then, in a single, fluid motion that seemed to defy the very concept of speed, she would raise the rifle to her shoulder, the sights aligning perfectly on a distant steel target without conscious thought. There was no sound, no wasted movement, just a silent union of woman and weapon. She was not training to be fast. She was training to be inevitable. On the small wooden ledge of her firing lane sat a single, gleaming brass casing. It was from the only round she had fired that evening, a cold-bore shot that had struck the dead center of the target 500 meters away. It was a monument to her philosophy. One perfect action is infinitely more valuable than 1,000 frantic, imperfect ones. Hidden behind a stack of sand-filled barricades, Private Evans watched her. He wasn't spying. He was studying. The events of the past few days had fundamentally shaken his understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. He had always equated skill with aggression, with the loud, fast, and obvious displays of power that Sergeant Graves embodied. But what he was witnessing now was something else entirely. It was a quietness that was more powerful than any shout, a stillness that was more potent than any frantic action. He watched the absolute economy of her movements, the way she seemed to exist outside the frantic timeline of the base, operating on her own internal, perfectly regulated clock. Anya lowered her rifle, the motion as smooth and deliberate as when she had raised it. She was unaware of her audience, and it would not have mattered if she had known. Her discipline was internal, her standards set by no one but herself. She was not defined by the opinions of Colonel Thorne or the awe of Private Evans or the humiliation of Sergeant Graves. She was defined by the silent, perfect geometry of her own actions. The wind gusted, swirling dust across the darkening range, but she remained at its center, an unwavering point of calm and control. The respect she now commanded on the base was not something she had sought or demanded. It had simply been revealed, an undeniable truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along, mistaken for a flaw. And like the unmoving mountains on the horizon, it would remain.